My son caught me playing. And did this a true story of forgiveness and healing? Have you ever had a moment in life where everything seemed ordinary, mundane, even but something about it sticks with you, like a pebble in your shoe? It's small, almost insignificant, yet you can't ignore it. That's where this story begins. A tiny, almost forgettable moment that would change everything for Elena. At 38, Elena's life in Harborfield was nothing extraordinary. She was juggling work, motherhood, and a new marriage that still felt more like a project than a partner. The coastal town she lived in was picturesque. Sure, waves crashing gently on the shore, pastel houses lining the street, and neighbors who always waved, but her life inside those perfect scenes was far from easy. If you peeked behind the curtain, you'd see a woman who was stretched thin, trying to keep all the plates spinning. Her new husband, Rich, was the dependable type of man of schedules and rule. It was part of what drew her to him, his steadiness. After the whirlwind of her first marriage, she thought a quiet, predictable life might be exactly what she needed. And it was. Until it wasn't. Blending their families, however, was proving to be its own challenge. Richard's son, Nathan, was polite but distant. At 22, he was old enough to have his own life, college class, a job, and a love for running that often had him out of the house more than in it. He wasn't unkind, but there was a wall there, and Elena didn't know how to get through it. She tried at first, asking about his class and offering to make his favorite meals, but he always kept their conversations surface level, giving just enough to be respectful but never enough to form a real bond. Over time, she stopped trying. He's an adult, she'd tell herself. He doesn't need a new mom, and yet, every time he brushed past her in the hallway, or gave a polite but curt response at dinner, it stung. It wasn't rejection, not exactly, but it wasn't acceptance either. That evening started like so many others. Elena had finally finished her work for the day and tucked the kids into bed. Her room, dimly lit by her favorite bedside lamp, had become her refuge, a place where she could decompress and let the weight of the day fall off her shoulders. She was scrolling through her phone, reading emails she had no intention of responding to until the morning when the sound of soft footsteps outside her door caught her attention. Nathan had just returned from his evening jog. His earbuds hung loosely around his neck, and his t-shirt clung to him from the humid summer air. As he passed her room, the faint light spilling out into the hallway stopped him in his tracks. He hesitated, unsure whether to keep walking or not. Finally, he pushed the door open just enough to peek in. Elena looked up, startled. "Nathan? Everything okay?" He shifted his weight, looking a little unsure of himself. "Yeah, just came back from a run. Thought I'd say hi." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's a first. You don't usually stop by just to talk." He smiled sheepishly and stepped fully into the room. "I guess I figured it's about time." Curious, she motioned to the chair by her bed. "All right, take a seat. What's on your mind?" At first, their conversation was light, almost trivial. Nathan told her about a stray dog that had chased him during his run, complete with an over-the-top impression of the dog's bark that made Elena laugh so hard she nearly spilled the tea she'd been sipping. It was the kind of easy moment they'd never really had before, and for the first time she felt like they might actually be connected. But then the tone shifted. Nathan leaned forward in the chair, resting his elbows on his knees. His face grew serious, the humor from a moment ago fading into something quieter, more thoughtful. "You know," he began, his voice low, "I've been meaning to ask you something." Elena tilted her head, intrigued. "What's that?" "How do you do it?" he asked. Balance everything. Work, kids, my dad. It's a lot. You make it look so easy, but I know it's not." The question caught her off guard. She chuckled nervously, unsure how to respond. "Trust me, it's not easy. Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water." Nathan nodded, his gaze unwavering. "But you do it anyway. Most people would have cracked by now. But not you. You keep going." Something about the way he said it stopped her in her track. It wasn't just a compliment, it was more than that. It felt like he saw her in a way that no one else, not even Richard. For the first time in a long time, Elena felt truly seen. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That means more than you know." For a moment, they just sat there in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward but was heavy with meaning. Nathan's eyes held hers, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just admiration, it was deeper, more intense, and it made her heart race in a way that both thrilled and terrified. Finally, Nathan broke the silence, standing up and brushing his hands on his shorts. "Well, I should probably hit the shower before Dad gets home." "Good talk." Elena nodded, forcing a smile as he turned and left the room. As soon as the door closed behind him, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her mind was spinning, replaying every word, every glance, every subtle shift in his tone. She told herself it was nothing, just a nice conversation. But deep down she knew better. There was an energy in the room, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. And as she sat there, staring at the empty doorway, one thought echoed in her mind. What if this wasn't just a fleeting moment? What if this was the start of something that could unravel everything she thought she knew about her life? The accidental bond. Have you ever felt a connection with someone you didn't expect? It's not something you plan, it just happened. One day you're strangers or acquaintances, and the next, there's a spark, an unspoken understanding. For Elena and Nathan, that spark had been lit. The days after their conversation, different. At first, Elena brushed it off as if it were her imagination, but there was no denying the shift in the air between them. They hadn't talked about it, not directly, but their interactions carried a new weight, an awareness that hadn't been there before. Nathan, who was usually quick to retreat to his room or head out for a run, started lingering in the common areas of the house. He'd casually help Elena set the dinner table, or stay in the kitchen a little longer after grabbing a snack. Elena noticed, but she didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what to say. One evening, As she was folding laundry in the living room, Nathan walked in and plopped down on the couch. He didn't speak at first, just scrolled through his phone while she worked. It wasn't until she held up one of his mismatched socks that he broke the silence. "Thanks for doing my laundry," he said, glancing up. "I don't think I've ever told you that." Elena laughed softly. "Well, I wouldn't call it a passion of mine, but someone's got to do it." He smiled, setting his phone down. "Still, I appreciate it. You don't have to, you know." "I know," she replied, her hands still busy folding. "But I want to. It's one of the few things I can do to help out around here." There it was again, that look, the same one he'd given her in her room. It wasn't inappropriate or overt, but it was intense, like he was seeing her in a way no one else did. It made her heart skip, and she had to force herself to focus on the laundry to avoid getting lost in the moment. As the weeks went on, these small, quiet moments between them became more frequent. At first, they were harmless. Nathan would help her chop vegetables for dinner, or they'd find themselves sharing the couch while watching a movie with the family. But there was an undercurrent to it all, a subtle tension that neither of them acknowledged but both of them felt. It wasn't just the moments they shared, it was how they shared them. Their conversations grew deeper and more personal. Nathan started opening up about things he hadn't mentioned before: his struggles balancing school and work, his complicated feelings about his dad remarrying, and even his hopes for the future. Elena found herself sharing too. She talked about her fears, her insecurities, and the weight she carried trying to make everyone happy. Nathan listened intently, his attention never wavered, and when he spoke, his words were always thoughtful, always kind. "I get why you feel that way," he said one night as they cleaned up after dinner. The rest of the family had already gone to bed, leaving them alone in the kitchen. "But you don't have to carry it all by yourself. You deserve to lean on people too." She glanced at him, her hands frozen mid-scrub over a plate. "It's not that easy, Nick. I've spent so long being the one everyone depends on. I don't know how to let that go." "Well," he said, leaning against the counter, "maybe it's time to learn." His words stayed with her long after she'd gone to bed. That there was something about the way he said them, not just the meaning but the care behind them, that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. It scared her how much she craved it. But fear wasn't the only thing creeping into her thought. There was excitement too. Every time Nathan walked into a room, her heart raced just a little fast. Every time their hands brushed while passing a dish or a glass, her breath hitched. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. One day, Richard suggested a family outing to the local farmer's market. Elena was hesitant. She loved the market, but the thought of being in a crowded place with Richard and Nathan at the same time felt complicated. Still, she agreed, knowing it would look strange if she didn't. The day was bright and breezy, perfect weather for wandering the stalls of fresh produce and handmade goods. Richard was in high spirits, chatting with vendors and picking out vegetables for dinner, while Nathan and Elena trailed behind. At one point, Richard wandered off to examine some homemade jams, leaving them alone. "Looks like he's on a mission," Nathan joked, nodding toward his dad. Elena, "He takes his jam selection very serious." They walked in silence for a moment, the sounds of the market buzzing around them. Then, without thinking, Nathan reached out and touched her arm lightly. "Elena," he said, his voice low, "I need to say something." She stopped walking, her heart pounding. "What is it?" He hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I don't know how to explain this, but I feel like we understand each other in a way no one else does. Do you feel that too?" Her breath caught in her throat. She knew she should say no, brush it off, and pretend she had no idea what he was talking about, but she couldn't. "Not this time." I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe." Nathan nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm not trying to make things weird. I had to say it. I couldn't keep pretending like nothing's changed." Before she could respond, Richard called out to them, waving a jar of jam triumphantly. The moment shattered, leaving Elena standing frozen as Nathan stepped away to join his dad. That night, as she lay in bed, Elena couldn't stop replaying the conversation in her mind. She knew they were walking a dangerous line, one that could destroy everything if they weren't careful. But the truth was, she didn't want to stop. Not the quiet intrigue. Do you know that feeling when you realize something small has grown into something big, but you don't know when it happened? That's where Elena found herself. What started as fleeting moments of connection with Nathan had turned into something she couldn't ignore. She told herself it wasn't wrong to feel close to him after all. They were family now. But deep down, she knew the truth was more complicated. The house had become a stage for stolen moments. Nathan seemed to always find reasons to be around her, and Elena couldn't deny how much she looked forward to it. It wasn't just the conversations, it was the way he looked at it, the way he listened. It felt different, special, even if she couldn't, or wouldn't, put a name to it. One Saturday afternoon, Elena was in the backyard pulling weeds from the flower. It was one of her favorite ways to clear her mind. The rhythm of digging and pulling helped her focus on something simple, something that didn't demand too much of her emotional. She didn't notice Nathan until his shadow fell over her. "You need some help?" he asked. Startled, she looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You garden?" He grinned. "Not really, but it looks like you could use a hand." She laughed. "Fine, grab some gloves and make yourself useful." They worked in silence for a while, side by side in the dirt. It was comfortable, almost peaceful, until Nathan spoke. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "Everything okay?" Elena paused, her hands stilling in the soil. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind, I guess." "Anything you want to talk about?" he asked, his tone soft, almost hesitant. She glanced at him, surprised by the offer. "I don't know. It's nothing serious. Just life." Nathan nodded. "Life can be a lot." It was such a simple statement, but the way he said it made her chest tighten. She realized she wanted to tell him, to open up about the weight she carried every day. But she stopped herself. How could she explain feelings she didn't fully understand? Instead, she changed the subject. "You've been around the house more lately. No classes keeping you busy?" He shrugged. "I guess I like being home more now." "It's nice." The way he said it made her heart skip. She wanted to believe it was innocent, but the look in his eyes told her otherwise. She forced herself to focus on the flowers, pretending she didn't notice. As the days went by, these quiet moments became more frequent. Sometimes they were planned, like when Nathan offered to help her prepare dinner, or run errands, but more often, they just happened. A brush of hands as they passed in the hallway. A shared laugh over something trivial. Each moment seemed small on its own, but together, they were building into something she couldn't ignore. One evening, the family decided to watch a movie together. Richard picked an old action film he loved, the kind with car chases and explosions that made it impossible to hear yourself think. Elena wasn't particularly interested, but she didn't want to seem distant, so she joined them on the couch. Nathan sat next to her, closer than usual. As the movie played, his arm rested on the back of the couch, just brushing her shoulder. It was such a small thing, but her skin tingled where they touched. She told herself it was nothing, just proximity, just a coincidence. But when Richard laughed at a particularly over-the-top scene, and turned to her to share the moment, she realized she hadn't even been watching the screen. Her mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on Nathan's presence beside her. When the movie ended, and everyone started heading to bed, Nathan lingered. Elena was tidying up the living room when he walked over. "Hey," he said softly. "Can we talk?" Her stomach flipped. "Now?" "Yeah," he said, glancing toward the hallway to make sure no one was listening. "It won't take long." She hesitated but nodded, leading him to the kitchen where they could speak without being overheard. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his expression serious. "What's on your mind?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. I feel like things have been different lately," he said. "Between us." Her heart pounded. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "I don't know how to explain it. I just feel like there's something here. Something we're not talking about." Elena swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "Nathan, we can't." "I know," he interrupted, his voice firm but not harsh. "I know it's complicated. I'm not trying to make things harder for you. I needed to say it." She looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "This isn't something we can talk about. It's better if we don't." He nodded, though his expression was pain. "Okay, I want you to know I'm here. For whatever you need." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. She couldn't bring herself to respond, so she just nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally walked away, the weight in her chest felt unbearable. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop replaying the conversation in her mind. She knew Nathan meant what he said, and part of her found comfort in it, but another part, a larger part, felt trapped, caught between what she wanted and what was right. The line between them was blurring, and she didn't know how to stop it, or if she even wanted to. Treading dangerous water. Have you ever felt like you were walking a tightrope, knowing one wrong step could send you falling, but you kept walking anyway? That's exactly how Elena felt. The line between her and Nathan had blurred to the point where she could barely see it anymore. Every glance, every word, every moment they shared felt charged with unspoken emotion, and yet she couldn't stop. Or maybe she didn't want to. It started becoming harder to hide. At family dinners, their eyes would meet across the table, lingering just a second too long. During casual conversations, their voices would soften when they spoke to each other, as if sharing a secret only they could hear. Elena noticed the subtle shift, and she worried Richard might notice it too. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Richard brought up an upcoming work trip. He would be gone for a few days, leaving Elena and Nathan to manage the house. The thought made her stomach flip, not with dread, but with anticipation. She hated herself for it. "That means you're in charge," Elena, Richard said with a smile. "Keep Nathan in line for me, will you?" Nathan grinned. "I'm not that much trouble." Elena forced a laugh. "We'll survive. Don't worry." The days leading up to Richard's trip were tense for Elena. She told herself over and over that nothing would happen. She wouldn't let it. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the excitement that bubbled beneath her nerve. When the day finally came, Richard kissed her goodbye at the door, his suitcase in hand. "I'll call when I get there," he said. "Don't let him eat all the snack." "I make no promises," Nathan called from the kitchen, earning a laugh from his dad. Elena waved as Richard drove away, her smile fading as soon as his car disappeared down the street. She turned to find Nathan standing in the doorway, watching her. "So," he said, his voice light, but his eyes serious. "Just us." She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Just us." That evening, they found themselves in the living room. Nathan had suggested a movie, and Elena agreed, thinking it would be a safe way to pass the time. But as they sat there, the distance between them on the couch growing smaller and smaller and smaller, Elena felt anything but safe. The movie played on, forgotten by both of them. Nathan's arm rested on the back of the couch, his fingers brushing her shoulder lightly. She didn't move away. She couldn't. The air between them was electric, the unspoken tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Elena," Nathan said softly, his voice breaking the silence. She turned to look at him, her heart pounding. "What?" "I can't keep pretending," he said. Whatever this is, it's real. You feel it too, don't you?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind raced, caught between denial and the truth she couldn't escape. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do." He leaned closer, his eyes locked on hers. "We don't have to figure it out right now. I need you to know I care about you, more than I probably should." Her breath hitched, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. But then, as if reality came crashing back, she pulled away, standing abruptly. "We can't, Nathan. This isn't. We can't." He didn't follow her. Instead, he sat there, his expression a mix of hurt and understanding. "I know," he said quietly. "I just needed to say it." Elena walked to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter. What was she doing? How had it come to this? She wanted to scream, to cry, to run. But more than anything, she wanted to turn around and go back. The next few days were a blur. She avoided Nathan as much as she could, throwing herself into housework and errands. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape it. He was there in every quiet moment, every stolen glance. One afternoon, as she was watering the plants in the backyard, Nathan joined her. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching her. Finally he spoke. Are we just going to keep pretending nothing happened, he asked. She set the watering can down, her hands shaking. What do you want me to say? That I'm confused? That I'm confused? That I'm scared? Because I am. I'm scared too, he admitted. But I can't stop how I feel. She turned to face, tears brimming in her eye. This isn't fair. To Richard, to you, to me. We can't do that. He stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to be honest. I care about you, Elena. More than I've ever cared about anyone. Her heart ached at his word, torn between the depth of his feelings and the reality of their situation. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Instead, she turned and walked back into the house, leaving him standing there alone. That night, as she lay in bed, Elena felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. She knew they were treading dangerous water, and every step forward felt like it could be their last. But despite the fear, she couldn't deny the truth. She didn't want to stop. It's a bold admission. There's a moment when the weight of a secret becomes unbearable, presses down on you until you can't breathe, until it feels like your chest might burst if you don't let it out. That's where Nathan was. He had kept his feelings bottled up for so long, hoping they would fade, but they hadn't. If anything, they had grown stronger, and he couldn't hold them in anymore. Elena had been avoiding him for days. She wasn't cold or unkind, but she was distant, keeping conversations short, leaving the room whenever he entered. He knew why. She was scared. Honestly, so was he, but he couldn't stand the silence between them. He had to break it. It was a quiet Saturday morning. Richard had gone to the hardware store, leaving Elena and Nathan alone in the house. She was in the kitchen, slicing fruit for breakfast when he walked in. For a moment he just watched, trying to find the right word. Hey, he said finally, his voice soft. She looked up, her hands stilling for a moment before she forced a smile. Morning. Nathan took a deep breath. Can we talk? Her heart sank. She knew this was coming. Nathan, I don't think. Please, he interrupted, stepping closer. Just let me say that. You don't even have to respond if you don't want to. Elena set the knife down, bracing herself. Okay, I'm listening. I'm listening. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how this happened. I don't even know when it started. But I care about you, Elena. Not like a stepmom or a friend. It's more than that. And I can't pretend it's not anymore. Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words out loud made it real in a way that terrified. Nathan, you can't. We can't, she started, but her voice faltered. I know, he said quickly. I know how wrong this sounds, but I can't change how I feel, and I don't think you can either. She looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. This isn't fair. To Richard, to you, to me. It can't happen. I'm not asking for anything, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I just needed you to know the truth. I can't keep hiding it. I can't keep pretending that I don't feel this way. Elena's chest felt tight, her thoughts a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and something else she didn't want to name. She knew he was right about one thing, she felt it too, but admitting it, even to herself, felt like stepping off a cliff. Before she could respond, the sound of the front door opening broke the moment. Richard's voice called out, cheerful and oblivious. I'm back. You won't believe the deal I got on paint. Elena turned away, busying herself with the fruit as Nathan stepped back, putting distance between them. The spell was broken, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Elena avoided being alone with Nathan, terrified of what might happen if they spoke again. But that night, as she lay in bed, his words echoed in her mind. I can't change how I feel, and I don't think you can either. She hated how true those words were. No matter how much she tried to push her feelings down, they always resurfaced, and the more she denied them, the stronger they seemed to grow. The next day, Elena decided she needed to set boundaries. She couldn't let this spiral any further. If she didn't stop it now, it would destroy everything. She found Nathan in the backyard, sitting on the patio with a book. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, she said, her voice firmer than she felt. He nodded, setting the book aside. Okay. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Whatever this is, it has to stop. We can't keep doing this. It's not fair to anyone. I know, he said quietly, but it's not that simple. It has to be, she insisted. We can't let this ruin everything. Richard trusts. He trusts you. We owe it to him to keep this family together. Nathan looked down, his jaw tight. And what about us? What about how we feel? Are we just supposed to pretend it doesn't exist? Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Because it can't exist. Not like this. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy, filled with words neither of them could say. Finally, Nathan stood, his expression resolute. I'll try. For you. For Dad. But I can't promise it'll be easy. Elena nodded, tears brimming in her eye. Thank you. As she walked away, she felt a mix of relief and heart. She had done the right thing. She knew that. But why did it feel so wrong? That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying their conversation. The look in his eye, the pain in his voice. She had set boundaries, but she wasn't sure she could keep, because no matter how hard she tried to fight it, the truth was clear. She didn't want to let him go. For the getaway, to Whispering Pines. Sometimes a change in scenery can make all the difference, or at least that's what Richard thought when he suggested a weekend getaway. Whispering Pines Lake was one of his favorite places, a quiet retreat nestled in the woods about an hour from home. The idea was simple, a peaceful weekend for the family to relax and reconnect. Elena hoped it would help ease the tension that had been building at home, even if it meant spending more time around Nathan. The drive to the lake was uneventful, filled with Richard's stories about previous trips and his plans to teach Nathan some fishing technique. Elena sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, trying to keep her thoughts from wandering. She could feel Nathan's gaze on her from the back seat occasionally, but she refused to meet his eye. When they arrived, the cabin was exactly as she remembered from their last visit, a cozy little house with a deck overlooking the water. Richard immediately busied himself unpacking and setting up fishing gear, while Nathan offered to help Elena prepare dinner. It was a simple enough task, chopping veg, setting the table, but every moment felt loaded with unspoken tension. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same bowl, and Elena quickly pulled back, pretending not to notice, but she could feel her heartbeat quicken. "Thanks for letting me help," Nathan said softly, breaking the silence. She glanced at him, her expression guarded. "It's just dinner, Nathan." He nodded but didn't say anything else. His silence was heavier than words, and she could feel the weight of everything he wasn't saying. The first evening passed without incident. They ate together on the deck, listening to the sounds of the lake as the sun set. Richard talked about his plans to fish at sunrise, and Nathan played along, asking questions and feigning enthusiasm. Elena tried to focus on the conversation, but her thoughts kept drifting. That night as she lay in bed, the stillness of the cabin seemed louder than ever. She couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, the tension in her chest refusing to let her relax. Finally she gave up and decided to step outside for some air. The deck was cool and quiet, the moonlight reflecting off the water like silver. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Couldn't sleep either. Nathan's voice startled her. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression soft but serious. "No," she admitted, "just needed some fresh air." He stepped onto the deck, keeping a respectful distance but still close enough that she could feel his presence. "This place is beautiful," he said, looking out at the lake. "It is," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there in silence for a while, the sound of the water lapping at the shore filling the space between them. Finally Nathan spoke. "Elena," he said, his voice low, "I know you're trying to avoid this, but I need to say it. Being here with you, it's hard to pretend everything is normal." She looked at him, her chest tightened. "Nathan, we can't do this." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop how I feel, and I don't think you can either." Tears stung her eyes and she turned away, staring out at the lake. "This isn't fair. To Richard, to you, to me. We can't keep doing this." "I'm not asking for anything," he said. I need you to know how much you mean to." She closed her eyes, the tears spilling over. "Nathan, this has to stop. It's not just about us. It's about everything we could destroy." He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you really think I don't know that? I've been trying to stop myself, but it's impossible. I care about you too much." For a moment she couldn't breathe. She wanted to tell him to leave, to walk away and never bring this up again, but she couldn't, because as much as she hated to admit it, she felt the same way. The sound of footsteps on the deck snapped her out of the moment. Richard appeared, holding a mug of tea and yawning. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Yeah," Elena said quickly, wiping her tear. "Just needed some air." Richard nodded, his gaze drifting to Nathan. "What about you?" "Same," Nathan said, his voice calm and steady. "It's nice out here." Richard smiled. "Well, don't stay up too late. Big day tomorrow." As Richard went back inside, Elena felt her knees weaken. She gripped the railing, trying to steady herself. Nathan stayed where he was, his expression unreadable. "I'll give you some space," he said finally, his voice soft. "Good night, Elena." She didn't respond, watching as he walked back into the cabin. When she was finally alone, she let out a shaky breath. The line between them was thinner than ever, and she didn't know how much longer they could pretend it didn't exist. The breaking point. Every secret has a breaking point. It doesn't matter how carefully you try to hide it or how many lies you tell yourself to justify it, eventually the truth starts to slip through the crack. And for Elena and Nathan, those cracks were beginning to show. The next morning at Whispering Pines Lake, Richard was up early, heading to the dock with his fishing rod. Nathan stayed behind, helping Elena clean up from breakfast. It was another one of those moments that felt simple on the surface, but was heavy with everything they weren't saying. As they washed the dishes side by side, their shoulders occasionally bumped. Elena could feel the tension building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. She knew they needed to talk, but the words felt impossible to say. "Can I ask you something?" Nathan finally broke the silence. She glanced at him, her heart racing. "What is it?" "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" he asked, his voice low. Elena froze, the plate in her hands slipping back into the soapy water. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, not looking at. "I don't know. Like you're going through the motions, doing what's expected of you, but it doesn't feel right." She knew exactly what he meant. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But that's just life, isn't it? You can't always do what you want." "But what if you could?" he asked, turning to face her. "What if there was someone that made you feel alive again?" Her chest tightened. She knew he wasn't just asking a hypothetical question. "Nathan, we can't keep having this conversation." "I know," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "But it's the truth, Elena. I can't stop thinking about you. About us." She set the sponge down, her hands trembling. "You need to stop. This can't go anywhere. It's wrong." "Is it really wrong to care about someone?" he asked, his eyes searching her. "To want to be happy?" Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps on the deck made them both jump. Richard walked in, holding up a string of fish with a triumphant grin. "Look at this haul," he said, oblivious to the tension in the room. "Dinner's on me tonight." Elena forced a smile, stepping away from the sink. "That's great, Richard." Nathan busied himself drying the dish, avoiding his father's gaze. The moment had passed, but the words Nathan had said lingered in Elena's mind. That evening, the three of them sat down to dinner on the deck. Richard was in high spirits, talking about his fishing trip and plans to come back to the lake next month. Nathan and Elena barely spoke, their silence stretching between them like a taut. After dinner, Richard suggested a short hike to watch the sunset. Elena hesitated, but Nathan quickly agreed, saying he could use the fresh air. The three of them set off into the wood, the trail winding up a gentle hill to a clearing with a perfect view of the lake. As the sun sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink. Richard pulled out his phone to take a photo. "You two stand together," he said, motioning for Nathan and Elena to pose. Elena's heart pounded as Nathan stepped closer, his shoulder brushing hers. She forced a smile as Richard snapped the picture, but inside she felt like she might shatter. As they made their way back to the cabin, Richard stopped to chat with a neighbor he recognized. Nathan and Elena walked ahead, the silence between them heavy. Finally, Nathan spoke. "I meant what I said earlier," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. She couldn't afford to let her emotions take over. Not here, not now. When they got back to the cabin, Elena excused herself, claiming she was tired. She retreated to her room, closing the door and leaning against, her chest heaving with suppressed emotion. She felt like she was coming apart at the seams, torn between what she wanted and what was right. A soft knock on the door startled her. Elena. Nathan's voice was quiet, hesitant. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "What is it, Nathan? Can we talk? Just for a minute?" She opened the door a crack, enough to see his face. He looked as torn as she felt. "This isn't a good idea." "I know," he said, "but I can't leave things like please." Against her better judgment, she stepped aside, letting him in. He closed the door behind him, keeping his distance. For a moment neither of them spoke. Finally he broke the silence. "I'm sorry if I've made things harder for you. That's the last thing I wanted." "You haven't," she said quickly. "This isn't your fault." "But it's not just me, is it?" he asked, his voice soft. "You feel it too." Her eyes filled with tears. "It doesn't matter how I feel. We can't do that." "I know," he said, stepping closer, "but I need you to know that I care about you, that I'll always care about you, no matter what happens." Her resolve crumbled. She turned away, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to do that, how to stop feeling this depth." Before he could respond, the sound of Richard's voice calling from the living room made them both freeze. "Elena? Nathan? You in there?" Nathan stepped back, his expression pained. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. "I promise." And then he was gone, slipping out the door just as Richard appeared in the hallway. Elena wiped her tears quickly, plastering a smile on her face as Richard walked in. "There you are," he said, oblivious. "I thought we could play cards or something." "Sure," she said, her voice shaky. "That sounds nice." As Richard led her back to the living room, Elena felt like she was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. The breaking point was near, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold everything together. A quiet decision. Sometimes the most pivotal moments in life aren't loud or dramatic. They come quietly, slipping into the spaces between words, leaving you to wrestle with their weight in silence. That's what happened to Elena as the trip to Whispering Pines came to an end. The ride home was uneventful on the surface. Richard hummed along to a classic rock station, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Nathan sat in the back seat, staring out the window, his face unreadable. Elena was next to Richard, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The silence between her and Nathan felt heavier than ever, but neither of them dared to break it. Back at home, life settled into its usual routine. Richard threw himself into work projects, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Nathan went back to his classes and a part-time job, but Elena could feel his presence everywhere, in the kitchen, the living room, and even in the quiet moments when she was alone. It was as if the air between them had changed, charged with something they couldn't name but couldn't ignore. One evening, Elena was in the backyard watering the plant. It had become her refuge, a place where she could think without interruption. As she moved from one flower bed to the next, she heard the back door open and close. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Nathan. "Hey," he said softly. She didn't look up. "Hey." For a moment he didn't say anything else. He just stood there, watching her. Finally he broke the silence. "We need to talk." Her stomach twisted. "Nathan." "Please," he interrupted, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Just hear me out." She set the watering can down and turned to face. "Okay, say what you need to say." He hesitated, searching for the right word. "I've been trying to figure this out, how I feel, what it means, but the truth is, I don't know if I can let this go." Her chest tightened. "Nathan, we don't have a choice. This has to stop." "I know it's complicated," he said, stepping closer, "but it's real. You can't tell me you don't feel it too." Her voice wavered. "It doesn't matter how I feel. It's not about us. It's about what's right." "But what if what's right doesn't feel right?" he asked, his voice breaking. "What if this is the only thing that does?" Tears filled her eyes, but she shook her head. "You don't understand. If we give in to this, we'll destroy everything, Richard. The family, everything we've worked." "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," he said. I can't stop how I feel." She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. "Nathan, this isn't just about you or me. It's about all of us. And I can't do that to Richard. I can't do that to myself." He was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "So that's it. We just pretend none of this ever happened." Her heart ached at the pain in his voice. "We have to, for everyone's sake." Nathan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Okay," he said finally. "If that's what you want." "It's not what I want," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But it's what has to be." He stepped back, his hands shoved into his pocket. "I guess that's that then." As he turned and walked back into the house, Elena felt a wave of relief mixed with unbearable sadness. She had made the right choice, the only choice, but it didn't make it any easier. That night, Elena sat alone in the living room, staring at the blank televisions. Her mind was racing, replaying every word, every look, every touch. She wanted to believe that things would go back to normal, that the distance she had created would protect them both. But deep down, she knew the truth. The feelings they shared weren't something she could simply turn off. Richard walked in, breaking her thought. "You okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. She forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." He sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "You've seemed distracted lately. Is everything okay?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him the truth, to unburden herself of the guilt and confusion that had been consuming her. But she couldn't. Instead, she squeezed his hand and said, "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." He nodded, accepting her answer without question. "Well, I'm here if you need anything." "Thanks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As Richard turned on the TV and settled into the couch, Elena felt a pang of guilt so sharp it made her chest ache. She knew she had to keep going, bury her feeling, and focus on the life she had built with Richard. But as she sat there, the weight of her decision pressed down on, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost something she could never get back. Richard's perspective. Have you ever been so caught up in your own life that you missed the signs of something simmering just below the surface? That's where Richard was. To him, everything seemed fine. He loved his wife, Elena, and was proud of the family they were building together. Sure, Nathan had been quieter lately, but Richard chalked it up to the pressures of school and work. After all, wasn't that normal for a young man in his 20s? Richard wasn't a man who overthought things. He liked routines, morning coffee, steady job, weekends spent tinkering with projects around the house. He believed in keeping life simple, and for the most part, it worked. But even Richard couldn't ignore that something felt off. It started with little things. He'd catch Elena staring off into space during dinner, her fork hovering mid-air as if she'd forgotten what she was doing. Or Nathan, who usually kept to himself, suddenly spent more time at home, always finding excuses to be in the same room as Elena. At first, Richard thought it was nice. Maybe they were finally bonding. But then he noticed how they avoided each other's eye, how their conversations were short and awkward, as if they were tiptoeing around something unsaid. One night, Richard came home late from work. The house was quiet, the lights dim. As he hung up his coat, he heard voices coming from the kitchen. He paused, listening. "I can't do this anymore." Nathan, Elena's voice, strained and quiet. "You don't mean that?" Nathan replied, his tone intense. Richard frowned, his hand frozen on the coat. He didn't want to eavesdrop, but something in their voices stopped him from stepping into the room. Before he could make sense of what he was hearing, the conversation ended abruptly, and Elena walked out of the kitchen, nearly bumping into him. "Oh," she said, startled. "I didn't hear you come in." "Everything okay?" he asked, searching her face. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eye. "Yeah, just tired." Nathan followed a moment later, his expression carefully neutral. "Hey, Dad," he said casually, grabbing a water bottle from the fridge. "Long day." "Yeah," Richard replied, watching him closely. "You." "Same old," Nathan said, disappearing down the hall. Richard didn't push, but the unease stayed with him. He wanted to believe it was nothing, that he was imagining things. But that night, as he lay in bed next to Elena, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, Richard decided to pay closer attention. He watched how Elena and Nathan interacted, looking for clues to explain the tension he'd felt. At breakfast they barely spoke, avoiding each other's gaze. When Nathan left for class, Elena lingered at the table, staring into her coffee cup. "You okay?" Richard asked, sitting down across from her. She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten he was there.
"Yeah.
Just a lot on my mind." "You've been saying that a lot lately," he said gently. "Is something going on?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, it's nothing. Really." He wanted to believe her, but the nagging feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. Later that afternoon he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone, looking at happier times, vacations, family dinners, the wedding. He wanted to remind himself of how good things had been, to convince himself that whatever was happening now was just a rough patch. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't know what was going on in his own home. He had been so focused on work, on keeping things stable, that he hadn't noticed when the cracks started to form. That evening, Richard suggested they all watch a movie together. It had been weeks since they'd spent time as a family, and he hoped it might bring them closer. Elena agreed, though she seemed reluctant, and Nathan joined them with a forced smile. As the movie played, Richard couldn't help but watch. Nathan sat at one end of the couch, Elena at the other. The distance between them was glaring, and yet, there was something in the way they avoided each other's eyes that set Richard's nerves on edge. "Everything okay?" he asked during a lull in the film. "Yeah," they both said at the same time, their voices too quick, too rehearsed. Richard didn't push. Instead, he sat back and pretended to watch the movie, though his mind was racing. Whatever was going on between them was bigger than he'd realized, and it scared him. Later that night, after Nathan had gone to bed, Richard confronted Elena. He found her in the kitchen, washing dishes, her shoulders tense. "Elena," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "What's going on?" She froze, her hands in the sink. "What do you mean? You've been distant." "Nathan's been acting strange, and I feel like I'm missing something." She turned to face, her expression guarded. "There's nothing going on, Richard. You're imagining things." "I don't think I am," he said quiet. "Talk to me, please." For a moment she looked like she might say something, but then she shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's nothing, I promise." Richard didn't believe her, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. "I love you, Elena. Whatever it is, we'll get through it." She nodded, but her smile was bittersweet. "I love you too." As they stood there in the quiet kitchen, Richard felt a deep sense of unease settles over him. He didn't know what was wrong, but he knew one thing for certain: something had shifted in his family, and it wouldn't be long before the truth came to light. Tiny confrontation. Every hidden truth eventually comes to light. For Elena, Nathan, and Richard, that moment was creeping close, looming like a storm on the horizon. The tension in the house had become unbearable, and Richard was determined to get to the bottom of it. What he didn't know was how unprepared he was for the answers he was about to uncover. It started with a simple question at dinner. The three of them sat at the table, the silence thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard cleared his throat, breaking the uneasy quiet. So he began, looking at Nathan. "How's school?" "Fine," Nathan replied without looking up from his plate. Richard turned to Elena. "And work?" "Busy," she said quickly, her eyes fixed on her fork. Richard sighed, setting his utensils down. All right, enough. I can't do this anymore. Something's going on and I'm tired of pretending I don't notice. Elena froze, her face pale. Nathan shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. Richard looked between them, his voice firm but calm. If there's something you need to tell me, now's the time. What are you talking about? Elena asked, her voice trembling. I'm talking about the way you've both been acting, Richard said. The silence, the tension, the looks you think I don't see. Something's not right, and I deserve to know what it is. Nathan looked at Elena, his expression unreadable. She avoided his gaze, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Dad, it's not, Nathan began, but Richard cut him off. Don't lie to me, he said, his voice rising. I can feel it. There's something between you and Elena, isn't there? Elena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need a minute, she said, rushing out of the room. Richard stared after her, his hands clenched into fists. He turned back to Nathan, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. Tell me the truth. Nathan hesitated, his face pale. It's complicated. Try me, Richard said, his voice cold. Nathan took a deep breath, his hands trembling. Dad, I have feelings for her. The words hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. Richard stared at him, his expression unreadable. What did you just say? I didn't mean for it to happen, Nathan said quickly. I tried to fight it, but what? Richard interrupted, his voice shaking with anger. You thought it was okay to go after my wife? My wife, Nathan. It's not like that, Nathan said, his voice desperate. I never wanted to hurt you. Well, congratulations, Richard said, standing up. You did, both of you. In the kitchen, Elena gripped the counter, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. She hadn't meant for it to come to this. All she had wanted was to build a family, to find a sense of belonging that had always eluded her. But now, that dream was crumbling before her eyes. She heard Richard's voice rise again in the dining room. I trusted you, Nathan. You're my son. How could you do this to me? Her heart ached at the pain in his voice. She wanted to go back in and fix it, to explain, but what could she say? That it wasn't what it looked like, that the feelings were real but nothing had happened. Even she didn't believe that would make it any better. Finally, summoning all her courage, she stepped back into the room. Richard, please, don't, he snapped, holding up a hand to stop. Don't say a word. She flinched at the anger in his voice, but she didn't retreat. You deserve the truth, she said softly. The truth? Richard laughed bitterly. What truth? That my wife and my son have been lying to, that the family I thought I had is a lie. It's not like that, she said quickly. We didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted, but it did happen, Richard said, his voice cold. And now what? You expect me to just forget about it? Pretend everything's fine? No, she said, tears streaming down her face. I don't expect anything. I'm so sorry. Richard turned away, his shoulders tense. You're sorry, that's great. But sorry, it doesn't fix. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan stared at the table, his face pale and drawn. Elena stood frozen, her heart breaking as she watched the man she loved struggle to process the betrayal. Finally, Richard turned back to them, his voice quieter but no less furious. I need time, he said. I need to figure out what to do. Elena nodded, her voice barely audible. I understand. And you, Richard said, pointing at Nathan, you stay away from. Do you hear me? Nathan nodded, his hands clenched into fists. I hear you. Without another word, Richard walked out of the room, leaving Elena and Nathan standing there, the weight of their choices crashing down on them like a tidal wave. Later that evening, after the house had fallen silent, Elena sat in the living room, staring at her hands. She wanted to say something, to try to make things right, but she didn't even know where to start. Upstairs, Nathan's door was shut, and Richard's absence in their shared bedroom spoke louder than any words could. As the hours dragged on, Elena knew one thing for sure: the family she had worked so hard to build would never be the same again. The fallout. When a family breaks, it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in fragments, sharp, jagged pieces that cut deeper with every passing moment. For Elena, Nathan, and Richard, the fallout from their confrontation left the house shrouded in silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any words could. Richard stayed away as much as he could. He left early in the morning for work and returned late, avoiding both Elena and Nathan. When he was home, he kept to himself, retreating to the guest room under the pretense of needing space. Elena tried to give him time, but every day that passed without a word from him felt like another crack forming in the fragile foundation of their family. Nathan, on the other hand, was a ghost. He spent most of his time locked in his room or out of the house entirely. When he did cross paths with Elena, their conversations were brief, almost clinical. The connection they once shared had been severed, leaving only the raw, aching remnants of what might have been. One evening, Elena sat alone in the living room, a cup of tea growing cold in her hand. She hadn't spoken to Richard in days, and the weight of his absence was suffocating. She had thought about going to him, trying to explain herself again, but what more could she say? Sorry wasn't enough. It never would. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Richard walked in, his expression unreadable. He paused when he saw her, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite identify: anger, sadness, maybe even regret. Richard, she said softly, setting the cup down. Can we talk? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what there is to say. There's a lot to say, she replied, standing up. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. But I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. Never meant for it to happen, he repeated bitterly. That's supposed to make it better. No, she admitted. Nothing can make this better. But I need you to understand that I love you. That hasn't changed. Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. You love me? You have a funny way of showing it. She flinched at his word, but she didn't back down. I made a mistake. A terrible, unforgivable mistake. But it doesn't change the fact that I want this family to work. Do you? He asked, his voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been doing everything you can to tear it apart. That's not fair, she said, her voice breaking. I've been trying to hold us together. I've been trying to be the glue that keeps this family from falling apart. And look where that got us, he snapped. Look at what we've become. Upstairs, Nathan sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hand. He could hear the muffled sound of their argument, each word cutting through him like a knife. He had never meant for things to go this far. He had tried to stop, to push his feelings aside, but no matter how hard he tried, they always came back strong. For the first time in weeks, he felt the urge to run, to leave the house, the town, maybe even the state. But where would he go? And what would running solve? He had created this mess, and now he had to face the consequences. Unable to stay at his room any longer, Nathan opened the door and made his way downstairs. He found Elena and Richard in the kitchen, their argument reaching a fever pitch. "Stop," Nathan said, his voice firm. Both Elena and Richard turned to him, their expressions a mix of surprise and anger. "This is my fault," Nathan said, stepping forward. "Not hers. I'm the one who crossed the line. I'm the one who ruined everything." Richard stared at him, his jaw clenched. "You're right about one thing, you did ruin everything. But don't you dare try to take all the blame? She's just as guilty as you are." "Richard, please," Elena began, but he cut her off. "No," Richard said, his voice shaking. "I'm done listening to excuses. I'm done trying to understand." Nathan looked at his father, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm sorry, Dad, for everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you." Richard's face softened for a moment, but then the anger returned. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Nathan. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done." The tension in the house reached its breaking point that night. Richard packed a bag and left, saying he needed time to think. Elena begged him to stay, but he wouldn't listen. Nathan offered to leave instead, but Richard waved him off, saying it wouldn't change anything. For the next few days, the house was unbearably quiet. Elena tried to reach out to Richard, but he didn't answer her call. Nathan stayed in his room, avoiding her as much as he could. Finally, after nearly a week of silence, Richard returned. He looked tired, older somehow, as if the weight of the past few days had aged. He called a family meeting, and for the first time in weeks, the three of them sat in the same room. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Richard began, his voice steady but weary, "and I've come to a decision." Elena and Nathan exchanged a nervous glance, neither of them daring to speak. "I can't live like this," Richard said. "I can't live in a house full of secrets and lies. So I'm leaving." Elena's heart sank. "Richard, please." "I'm not asking for your permission," he interrupted. "I need time to figure out who I am outside of this mess. Maybe I'll come back, maybe I won't, but right now I need space." Nathan looked down at his hand, his guilt written all over his face. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely audible. Richard didn't respond. He stood up, grabbed his bag, and walked out the door, leaving Elena and Nathan to face the aftermath of their choice. Path forward. After Richard left, the house felt like a shell of its former self. The echoes of what once was lingered in every corner, in every silence. Elena and Nathan carried on in their own way, but neither of them could escape the weight of what had happened. Elena threw herself into her work. She started taking on extra hours, filling her days to the brim to avoid being home, to avoid facing the emptiness Richard had left behind. She told herself she was being productive, but in truth she was running from her mistakes, from her guilt, from the shattered family she had once dreamed of building. Nathan, on the other hand, withdrew completely. He stopped going to his class and stopped seeing his friend. He spent most of his days alone in his room, staring at the ceiling, or mindlessly scrolling through his phone. Every now and then he would think about leaving, packing a bag and starting over somewhere far away. But each time, he would stop himself, paralyzed by the fear of what lay beyond the walls of the house he once called home. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after Richard left, Elena came home early from work. The house was quiet, as it always was these days. She set her bag down and headed to the kitchen, planning to make herself a cup of tea. As she reached for the kettle, she heard a noise behind her. Turning, she saw Nathan standing in the doorway. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," he replied, his voice low. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Nathan stepped forward, his hands shoved deep into his pocket. "I was thinking, maybe I should leave." Elena's heart sank. "Leave? Why?" "Because I'm the reason all of this happened," he said, his voice trembling. "If I wasn't here, maybe Dad would come back. Maybe things would go back to normal." "That's not true," she said quickly. "This isn't just your fault, Nathan. It's mine too. And leaving won't fix anything. It'll just make things worse." Nathan looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "I don't know what to do anymore." Elena stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Neither do I. But running away isn't the answer. We have to face this, even if it's hard." How he asked. "How do we fix something that's so broken?" She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know, but we have to try. For Richard, for us, for this family." That evening, Elena sat down at the kitchen table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. She stared at it for a long time, her mind racing. Finally, she began to write. The words didn't come easily, but she forced herself to keep going. When she was done, she folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. The next day, she dropped it in the mail. Richard received the letter 3 days later. He had been staying at a small motel on the edge of town, trying to make sense of everything. When he saw Elena's handwriting on the envelope, his first instinct was to toss it aside, but something made him stop. Slowly he opened it and began to read. "Dear Richard, I don't know how to begin this letter, so I'll start with the only thing I know for sure. I'm sorry. I know those words aren't enough, and they never will be, but I need you to hear them. I made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. And every day since, I've been trying to figure out how to make it right. The truth is, I don't know if I can, but I want to try if you'll let me. I love you, Richard. I always have, and I always will, and I know I've let you down in the worst possible way, but I'm begging you to give me a chance to prove that this family is worth fighting. Please come home, even if it's just to talk, even if it's just to tell me you're done. I need to hear it from you, face to face. Love, Elena." Richard read the letter twice, then a third time. By the time he finished, his hands were trembling. He set the letter down and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know if he could forgive Elena, or Nathan, Nathan, or even himself, but a small part of him, a part he had tried to ignore, wanted to try. 3 days later, Richard walked through the front door of the house. Elena was in the living room, and she froze when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard set his bag down and sighed. "We need to talk." Elena nodded, her heart pounding. "Okay." Nathan appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Dad." "Not now," Richard said firmly. "This is between me and her." Nathan nodded and stepped back, disappearing down the hall. Richard sat down on the couch, motioning for Elena to join him. She did, her hands trembling. "I read your letter," he began, "and I've been thinking about what you said, about fighting for this family." And she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know if I can," he admitted. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to forgive you, but I'm willing to try." Elena's breath. "You are." He nodded. "On one condition. Nathan has to leave. At least for now. I can't heal with him here." Elena's heart broke, but she nodded. "Okay, I'll talk to him." That night, Elena sat down with Nathan and told him what Richard had said. Nathan agreed without hesitation. He packed a bag and left the next morning, saying goodbye to Elena with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, hugging her tightly. "For everything." "I know," she replied. "Me too." As he walked out the door, Elena felt a sense of loss so profound it nearly knocked her off her feet. But she also felt a glimmer of hope, a small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. A new beginning. When Nathan left the house, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The silence he left behind was different from the one Richard's departure had created. This silence carried a sense of finality, as if the house itself was mourning the loss of the family it had once held together. For the first few days, Elena and Richard barely spoke. They moved around each other like shadows, both unsure of how to rebuild what had been broken. Elena wanted to give Richard space, but she also wanted to fight for their marriage. She just didn't know where to begin. One morning, Richard surprised her. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, something he hadn't done in weeks. When she walked in, he looked up and motioned for her to join him. "Good morning," he said, his tone softer than she expected. "Good morning," she replied, sitting down across from him. For a moment they just sat, the quiet between them oddly comfortable. Finally, Richard spoke. "I've been thinking about everything." Elena's heart pounded. And I think I want to try," he said, meeting her eye. "I don't know if we'll ever get back to where we were, but I want to see if we can. For us. For what we used to have." Tears welled up in her eye. "I want that too." From that day forward, they began to take small steps toward healing. It wasn't easy. The wounds were deep, and trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. But they were both willing to try, and that was what mattered. Elena suggested they start couples counseling, and to her surprise, Richard agreed. Their first session was awkward and uncomfortable, but it was also a turning point. For the first time in weeks, they began to truly communicate, not just about what had happened, but about everything that had led them to that point. "I felt like I was losing you," Elena admitted during one session. "That's why I tried so hard to keep the family together. I thought if I could make everything perfect, we'd be okay." "You don't have to be perfect," Richard said. "You just have to be honest." Those words stuck with her. Honesty wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And slowly, as the weeks turned into months, they began to find their way back to each other. Nathan, meanwhile, was struggling to find his footing. He had moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, using his part-time job to cover the rent. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. He spent most of his days working or walking aimlessly through the city, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Elena. "Hi Nathan, just wanted to check in. How are you?" He stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I'm okay. How's Dad?" "He's doing better," she wrote. Nathan felt a pang of guilt. He had left to give them space, but he hadn't realized how much he would miss. He wanted to ask if he could visit, but he didn't know if it was too soon. Instead, he typed, "That's good to hear. I'm glad." Elena replied almost immediately, "We're glad too. We miss you." As the months went by, things began to change. Elena and Richard continued their counseling, and while there were still difficult days, they were slowly finding a new rhythm. They started going on small dates again, dinners at their favorite restaurant and walks along the beach. Each step felt like a victory, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Nathan also began to find his footing. He started attending a local support group where he met people who were dealing with their own struggle. It helped to talk, to hear other people's story, and to realize he wasn't alone. Slowly, he began to feel like he could move forward. On one weekend, about 6 months after Nathan left, Elena and Richard invited him over for dinner. Nathan hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready to face them again, but eventually he agreed. When he walked through the front door, it felt like stepping into a memory. The house looked the same, but it felt different, lighter somehow. Richard greeted him with a nod, and Elena pulled him into a hug. "It's good to see you," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You too," he replied. Dinner was a little awkward at first, but as the evening went on, the tension began to ease. They talked about mundane things, work, the weather, a new show they had all started watching. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Before Nathan left that night, Richard pulled him aside. "I'm still angry," he admitted, "but I don't want to lose you. You're my son, Nate, and no matter what's happened, that hasn't changed." Nathan's throat tightened. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot." By the time Nathan left, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in months. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time it felt like there was no road at all. Elena stood at the window, watching as Nathan's car disappeared down the street. Richard came up behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Do you think we'll be okay?" she asked softly. "I think we will," he replied. "It's going to take time, but we'll get together." And for the first time in a long time, she believed. Closure. And moving on. The months passed, and the house began to feel like a home again. The shadows of what had happened still lingered, but they no longer defined the space. Elena and Richard were finding a new rhythm, one built on honesty and patience. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. and that was enough. For Nathan, the journey was slower. Living on his own had forced him to confront parts of himself he had long ignored. He started journaling, something his support group had suggested, and found it oddly therapeutic. He wrote about his regrets, his hopes, and his fears, and slowly, he began to see a path forward, not one where he erased the past, but one where he learned from. One day, Nathan received a call from Elena. Her voice was warm, but there was a hint of nervousness. "Hi Nathan," she said. "How are you?" "I'm good," he replied. "How about you?" "We're doing okay," she said. "Listen, Richard and I were talking, and we thought it might be nice to have you over for dinner again." No pressure, of course. Nathan hesitated. The last dinner had gone well, but he still felt like an outsider in the family he had once been a part of. Still, he wanted to try. "I'd like that," he said finally. The dinner was simple but heartfelt. Richard grilled steaks in the backyard, while Elena set the table with her favorite blue dish. When Nathan arrived, they greeted him with smile, and for the first time in a long time he felt at ease. They ate outside, the evening air cool but pleasant. Conversation flowed more naturally than it had in months. They talked about small things, work, hobby, a new book Elena had started reading. But by the time dessert was served, the mood had shifted. Nathan set his fork down and looked at Richard. "Dad, can I say something?" Richard nodded. "Of course. I wanted to say thank you," Nathan said, his voice steady, "for giving me another chance. I know I don't deserve it, but it means a lot." Richard studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're my son, Nathan, and no matter what's happened, that's not going to change. But you're right, you need to earn this chance, and I believe you will." Elena smiled, her eyes misty. "We've all made mistakes," she said, "but we're still here, and that has to mean something." In the months that followed, life began to settle into a new normal. Richard and Elena continued their counseling, working through the layers of hurt and mistrust. Nathan focused on rebuilding his life, finding solace in his support group, and the small victories that came with personal growth. One weekend, Elena suggested a family outing, a hike at Whispering Pines Lake, the place where everything had begun to unravel. At first Richard was hesitant, but he eventually agreed. The drive to the lake was quiet but not tense. When they arrived, the familiar sights and sounds stirred a mix of emotions in all of them. But as they started the hike, the weight of the past seemed to lift. They reached the top of the trail just as the sun was beginning to set, casting the lake in shades of gold and pink. For a while they stood in silence, taking in the view. "It's beautiful," Elena said softly. "It is," Richard agreed, his voice warm. Nathan nodded, a small smile on his face. For the first time in a long time he felt like he belonged. As they made their way back down the trail, Elena slipped her hand into Richard. He looked at her, surprised, but didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volume. When they reached the car, Nathan turned to them. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Richard clapped him on the shoulder. "We're proud of you." Elena hugged him tightly. "We are." The journey wasn't over, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time they all felt like they were moving in the right direction together.